March 1945. The Scheldt Estuary. The night did not fall gently. It settled like a weight. A cold wind came off the North Sea, carrying mist and salt and the faint metallic scent of burning fuel from ships that had passed earlier in the week. Visibility was poor, though not by accident. Smoke from earlier bombardment still lingered over the tidal flats, mixing with the damp air and turning distance into uncertainty. American Marine officers stood over their plotting tables aboard a command vessel anchored offshore, watching signal lamps flicker through the haze. Across the water, British Royal Marines of 40 Commando were moving toward the shoreline. There was no dramatic announcement, no speech broadcast to the fleet, just a simple order, already given. Proceed. The landing craft cut through the dark water in staggered formation. Engines were kept as quiet as possible. Navigation relied on compass bearings and timed intervals more than sight. The tide was running stronger than expected, and German defensive positions along the embankments were believed to be alert. Through field glasses, American observers could barely distinguish the silhouettes of the craft against the low horizon. Then the first artillery flare rose, not from the sea, from inland. It burned white for several seconds, revealing mudflats, broken pilings, and the forward sections of the British landing wave already disembarking. The Marines aboard the American command vessel did not cheer. They leaned closer to their instruments, because what was about to unfold would not be judged by bravery, but by execution. And in that thin strip of contested shoreline, in poor light and rising wind, 40 Commando stepped into contact. The objective itself did not look impressive on a map. A narrow peninsula, mud, reed banks, oil storage tanks, dock facilities that had seen better days. But in 1945, geography was leverage. The Scheldt Estuary controlled access to Antwerp, and Antwerp controlled supply. Without the port functioning at full capacity, Allied armies pushing into northern Germany would slow, not because of enemy resistance, but because of fuel, ammunition, and food. The Germans understood this. That is why they fortified every approach. Coastal guns were positioned to sweep the tidal flats. Concrete casemates overlooked the likely landing zones. Demolition teams were prepared to destroy harbor installations at the first confirmed breach. It was not a grand battlefield. It was a choke point, and choke points do not require spectacle. They require control. The Americans knew that if the British failed to secure the peninsula quickly, the entire supply chain feeding the Western Front could tighten. Divisions pushing east would feel it days later. That was the calculation, not glory, logistics, which is precisely why senior American Marine officers were watching so closely, because a delayed landing here would ripple through the entire theater. And because 40 Commando was about to attempt it under conditions that reduced every margin for error. Before anyone could argue about heroism, there was the map. The peninsula was not valuable because it was famous. It was valuable because it was a lever. A narrow, low-lying wedge of land that controlled water, pipelines, and access. One of those places that looks small in a briefing room and becomes enormous once men start dying for it. By late war, the Allies had learned that ports and fuel were not supporting details. They were the war. Armies did not advance on courage. They advanced on tonnage, ammunition, rations, spare parts, bridge sections, medical stores, replacement engines, lubricants, and fuel drums moving at steady pace. If you controlled the corridor that carried them, you controlled the speed of the campaign. This was why the peninsula mattered. It sat where shipping lanes narrowed and where industrial infrastructure, refineries, pumping stations, storage tanks, loading rigs, concentrated into a small number of targets. Not targets in a newspaper sense, but targets in a staff sense. A few points that, if damaged, would impose weeks of delay. Worse than delay, they would impose improvisation. And improvisation is where accidents, shortages, and stalled offensives breed. The Germans understood this. They had made a habit of turning infrastructure into a weapon when retreat became the only form of strategy left. A bridge destroyed at the right time forces an entire division to stop. A fuel depot burned at the wrong time forces a corps to ration movement. A port rendered unusable forces convoys to unload elsewhere, then haul supplies over longer roads under air attack. None of these choices is dramatic. They are simply expensive. Allied planners also understood another uncomfortable fact. Once a port or a pumping station is destroyed, taking it back does not restore it. Occupying a ruin does not make it functional. The war could be won and still become harder, simply because the facilities needed to sustain victory had been wrecked in the final weeks. So when the operation was authorized, it was not framed as a raid. It was framed as denial, denying the enemy the chance to sabotage, mine, torch, and poison the very ground the Allies would soon need to stand on. The British were tasked to seize key points quickly and hold them while engineers arrived, while demolition teams were hunted, while the broader front adjusted. That meant moving before every uncertainty could be resolved, and this was what drew the attention of the Americans watching from offshore. The question was not whether the British could fight. The question was whether they would accept the kind of imperfect information that makes commanders hesitate and still act with discipline. In other words, whether they could move fast without becoming careless. Because in this sort of operation, a single mistake is not just casualties. It is a fire you cannot put out, a channel you cannot use, a supply plan that collapses quietly, days later, for reasons the public never sees. That was the real weight on the map that night. The Sandstorm was not part of the plan. It arrived without ceremony, first as a haze on the horizon, then as a wall. Wind accelerated across the flats and turned the air into something physical, something that pressed against the body and forced men to squint through goggles already coated in dust. Helicopter crews reported diminishing visibility. Navigation lights blurred into orange smears. Radios crackled under interference. At sea, officers recalculated. In ideal conditions, the assault would unfold with layered precision, timed insertions, overlapping fire support, coordinated landings from air and sea. With visibility collapsing, those layers began to fray. Pilots could not see landing zones. Forward observers could not confirm reference points. Navigation became instrument-based rather than visual. There is a particular kind of hesitation that comes in such moments. Not fear, calculation. Storms create ambiguity. Ambiguity creates risk. And risk, when multiplied by live ammunition and demolition charges, becomes lethal. One wrong grid reference in clear weather can be corrected. In a sandstorm, it compounds. The safer option was obvious. Delay. Wait for visibility to improve. Adjust H-hour. Preserve aircraft and men. Except that the enemy might use the additional time to mine a platform, ignite a storage tank, rig a pumping station. This was the decision point. From the American side, watching from ships and command posts, there was awareness of that calculation. U.S. Marines had already learned that weather in this theater did not behave politely. Sand could shut down engines, foul optics, grind against metal. Rotary wing aircraft were particularly vulnerable. A helicopter that cannot see the ground cannot trust the ground. And yet the British chose to go. Not impulsively, not theatrically. The pilots shifted to instrument navigation. Crews tightened procedures. Landing zones were simplified. Contingencies were accepted rather than eliminated. The decision was not framed as bravery. It was framed as necessity, because every hour of delay increased the probability that the installations would be sabotaged. Demolition teams do not need daylight, they need time, so the aircraft lifted. Sea Kings and Chinooks moved through air that felt solid. Inside, Marines sat hunched under webbing and equipment, eyes closed or fixed downward, listening to rotor pitch change as pilots adjusted to invisible terrain. In landing craft, men felt the hull slap against shallow water they could not see. There was no cinematic clarity, no horizon, no sense of scale. Just noise and vibration and sand pressing against metal. When the first waves reached the ground, they did not step into a dramatic tableau. They stepped into confusion. Landmarks were obscured. Lines of sight shortened to meters. Command and control depended on rehearsed drills rather than visual coordination. This was the test the Americans later discussed. Not whether 40 Commando could fight in a storm, but whether they would. Whether they would accept degraded conditions and still maintain cohesion, because fighting well in clear weather is competence. Maintaining order when nature strips away clarity, that is discipline. When the first Marines from 40 Commando stepped off the landing craft and helicopters onto Al-Faw, There was no dramatic line of resistance waiting for them. There was something more dangerous: uncertainty. The storm swallowed distance. Shapes emerged only at the last moment. Oil structures, berms, low buildings, ditches cut into the flat terrain. In that compressed visibility, identification became difficult. And in night operations, difficulty is where mistakes begin. Initial contact came in fragments. Small arms fire from a structure near one of the pumping stations. Tracer rounds cutting sideways through the dust. The sound of rounds striking metal scaffolding around the oil installations, echoing strangely in the confined industrial spaces. There was no large Iraqi formation maneuvering across open ground. Instead, resistance came from localized positions, fighters using what cover they had, firing and then shifting. What U.S. Marines later noted was not the intensity of the fire, but the control of the response. British Marines did not answer every muzzle flash with volume. They answered with direction. Fire was returned deliberately. Sections maneuvered by drill, 2 elements moving, 1 covering, without the need for shouted corrections. In the storm, voice commands were swallowed by wind. Hand signals, proximity, and repetition carried the engagement. There was also restraint around the infrastructure itself. This was an industrial target layered with flammable material. Fuel lines, storage units, platforms, any stray round in the wrong place could ignite something that could not be extinguished. So fire discipline was not a matter of ammunition economy. It was strategic necessity. Teams cleared structures methodically. Doors were breached without excess. Rooms were checked and secured rather than flattened. Demolition points were identified and neutralized. At one of the offshore platforms, Marines moved through tight corridors with limited light, expecting charges to be set. They encountered resistance in confined spaces, short bursts of engagement measured in seconds, not minutes. Grenades were used where appropriate, but not indiscriminately. The Americans, observing through feeds and reports, began to see a pattern. This was not a force attempting to overwhelm by saturation. It was a force operating within constraints: weather, infrastructure, civilian proximity, and adjusting accordingly. There were moments of friction. A section temporarily lost orientation when visual markers disappeared in the dust. A landing element touched down slightly offset from its intended point and had to correct under fire. Communications required repetition, but cohesion held. The first hours did not produce dramatic casualty figures or spectacular footage. They produced something quieter: control under degraded conditions. By dawn, such as it could be distinguished through the thinning storm, the primary objectives were in British hands. Demolition attempts had been prevented. Key pumping stations were secured. Enemy resistance had been suppressed or driven off in small pockets. From the American side, the early assessment was cautious. It was too soon to judge fully, but there was recognition of something specific. 40 Commando had executed an amphibious assault at night in a sandstorm against armed resistance, with a strategic constraint on firepower, and had done so without losing tempo or discipline. For U.S. Marines, that combination stood out. The American Marines watching events unfold were not looking for spectacle. They were looking for indicators, small signals that reveal whether a unit is in control or barely holding together. What they noticed first was spacing. Even in reduced visibility, British sections maintained consistent intervals. Not perfect alignment, not parade ground neatness, but combat spacing that suggested rehearsed instinct rather than improvisation. In a storm that stripped away visual references, men still moved as if they understood where their partners would be. That is rarely accidental. They noticed the absence of overcorrection. When contact came, British Marines did not surge forward recklessly, nor did they freeze. They maneuvered within defined arcs. Fire support was requested only when necessary. There was no visible rush to escalate beyond what the situation required. To American observers accustomed to the doctrine of overwhelming application of force, this restraint was not interpreted as hesitation. It was read as confidence. They also noticed something less visible but equally important: tempo under friction. Helicopter insertions in degraded conditions often produce cascading delays. A late arrival creates a gap. A gap creates uncertainty. Uncertainty spreads. Yet reports indicated that once on the ground, 40 Commando re-established its timing quickly. Sections that landed offset corrected position without waiting for detailed instruction. Subunits that lost brief contact with adjacent elements regained alignment through pre-briefed rally points. This suggested preparation beyond the immediate mission. It suggested a unit trained to operate when the plan no longer matched reality. American Marines recognized that immediately. There was also attention paid to how the British handled infrastructure. In U.S. doctrine, a high-value industrial target in hostile territory would normally justify significant preparatory fires. Yet here, the British were advancing inside a critical oil complex with minimal visible damage. The platforms remained intact. The pumping stations were operational. There were no secondary explosions spreading across the facility.